have provided for us, and also I think to reflect on some of the things that Sid presented at the outset, some of the realities of this kind of work. So I want to talk tonight really about some interesting ideas and topics rather than solutions or proposals. I have anything along the lines that we presented for you, but I think it's to begin to think about the kind of work that you're all involved with and the kinds of challenges that you experience and the kinds of things that we can do together to address some of these things. So the reality of this is that Sid presented some stats at the outset tonight that are drawn from the entire Australian population. We don't know very much about the prevalence of mental health problems in startup cultures. We don't know very much about the kinds of stressors that people experience. We don't know about the kinds of social supports that are able to draw on. We don't know about the particular nature of the work that they do, what particular stressors might be present in that work. So what I'm going to present tonight is some insights that we've derived from other fields of work that might be relevant for you. So for a long time, we've studied these sorts of problems in conventional organisational settings. And so we know quite a lot about mental health at work. And I think there's a good deal in this literature that could be relevant for you, could be interesting. My sense, given what I've heard tonight and my sense of the work in startup communities, my sense is that the kinds of stressors that we've identified in the work literature are probably going to be even more pronounced in startup cultures. So there's three that stand out for me, and I wanted to present these three tonight really as a way of sort of opening out into a conversation, because I'll close with some ideas around what I think we can do about these. So I think three are worth pointing out. The first is fuzzy role boundaries. I'm going to speak to each of these points sequentially. Fuzzy role boundaries, uncertain and constantly evolving work demands, and managing insecurity. So I think all startup cultures internationally are characterised by progressive breakdown of traditional work, life and social role boundaries. I think conventionally we think about work as very paid work in particular, a very particular kind of organisational setting, very particular set of role demands with a clear distinction between work and non-work. It strikes me that in startup cultures those boundaries, they're dissolving in all parts of work, but they seem to be almost entirely absent in startup cultures. Now, partly this is shaped by changes in the nature of work itself and the role of various digital and social platforms that blur work-life distinctions. But my sense is that, and I think Sid spoke to this in his talk, is that what seems to be characterised by startup culture is this sense that it's an entire all-of-life pursuit, that all of one's waking life is devoted to the work. And I think what's particularly distinctive about this is a blurring of personal and professional networks. I think this is particularly consonant with the rise of social media platforms and the way different social media platforms are used in startup cultures. And I think what you see here is a blurring of personal networks, professional networks, and how these two things are held separate. I think what we find here is a sense that there is no sense that there is my personal life and my professional life, that there is the kind of life that I'm living. Now we know from a lot of the organisational literature that's not always a healthy thing, a healthy way to live. So I think social media is accelerating these changes, and one of the key issues here in the literature is managing the issue of disclosure. Now, for a long time in organisational studies, we've focused on the risks associated with disclosing a mental health condition in a workplace setting. Now, the big one there is stigma, of course, but also the idea of reputational damage, that if you come into a work environment and you disclose that you've been diagnosed with a mood disorder or with an affective disorder, that there's the risk of stigma from one's colleagues, but of course there's also the risk that people will think less of you. Now, the issue I think in relation to startup cultures is that how typically we find that social networks, and I think the first speaker spoke to this, that social networks are critically important protective factors for people experiencing mental health problems. But the issue with social networks is that we can manage our disclosure normally fairly carefully. We can choose who of our friends we're going to disclose our circumstances to and who we perhaps will refrain from disclosing that to. Now, the issue I think in a lot of startup cultures is that if all of your social life is managed around your professional networks, disclosure becomes much more difficult. If you're disclosing aspects to your friends and they're also in your professional communities, issues of disclosure become much more difficult. And I could probably skip through some of this fairly quickly because I'm sure that this will be very familiar to all of you. But the key thing here is that in startup cultures, this uncertain and evolving work-life demands, the nature of the work changes rapidly. And I think this leads to the kind of burnout and reasons I spoke about. That I mean, these are incredibly difficult roles to take on. This is difficult work. So startups typically require individuals in small groups to take on diverse roles, demands and competencies, juggling the acquisition of new skills, making new contacts, sustaining social networks, professional networks, cultivating one's brand, defining one's sense of purpose. I mean, they're difficult things to do. Typically difficult where people are trying to, in a sense, conduct this on the fly in the middle of managing quite difficult professional competencies as well. So I think certainly this can be a very exciting and rewarding work, but Sid has already mentioned how isolating, stressful, demanding and consuming this work can be. So in typical work contexts, these are all really strong predictors of mental health problems. So the issue is how do we identify these sorts of factors in startup cultures and what can we do about them? I think the point here is that it's not surprising to see some of the stats that Sid showed at the outset, that, I mean, this is incredibly demanding work, and these are strong predictors of mental health problems. So it's not surprising that we're seeing the kind of prevalence that we're seeing. The other aspect here is managing insecurity or precarity. That startup cultures are characterised by high rates of failure. Now this is often turned into a virtue, the classic kind of making virtue of necessity. That this notion of failing fast, getting up and starting again, Marita's already spoken about this. I mean, this is hard to do, emotionally hard to do, professionally hard to do, personally hard to do. So I think, particularly in Melbourne, startup cultures lack strong cultural, social and financial support. I think that's changing very rapidly, but I don't think Melbourne is one of the kind of tech startup cultures, internationally. I don't know that we necessarily identify this as one of the strongest ones. And so what I think I've found in the work that I've done is that we don't necessarily have the kind of social infrastructures that you see in other parts of the world. I think we're rapidly in the process of trying to develop those infrastructures, and this group is obviously a great example of that. But I think, this would be a key concern that I have, that startup cultures are young cultures. And I think Marie spoke about, these are, in a sense, the kind of getting of wisdom, the kind of life skills that we acquire through a lifetime of work. People coming to this work, skewing towards those aged under 35, these are difficult life skills to learn. And how we manage these sorts of challenges, social, financial, professional insecurity, in the work that I've done, the taking the leap from paid work, secure work with entitlements, with benefits. It's a big thing to give that up for the excitement of, well, this is what I really want to be doing in life, and weighing up that kind of risk and uncertainty is really challenging. Particularly if it doesn't work in the first instance, particularly if that first startup fails, the courage and the sort of resilience that it requires to get back up again and try again. The other thing I've spent a bit of time on is focusing on youth cultures, at the point at which it becomes important for people to start thinking about something other than work. And parenting is the big one, obviously. At the point at which people decide, I've been working on my startup for 5 years, my partner and I are thinking about having a child, am I financially secure enough to do this? Obviously in a city like Melbourne with high property prices, I'm into my 30s, I'm renting the part of the city that I want to live in, I need to be earning $250,000 a year to afford a property here. My startup's got to succeed, or my partner's, kind of walking away from this. These are the kinds of transitions in life that in organisational settings we know are really strong predictors of mental health problems. Obviously, managing financial insecurity is challenging for everyone. So the thing I want to close with is, these are all very well-known things. The point I want to make is that it's not surprising that we should be talking about mental health in the context of startup cultures, because these are cultures that are characterised by a whole host of really strong predictors of mental health problems. And so then the challenge is, what can we do about that? And so I think tonight, I'm not going to necessarily present anything that will be a great surprise to you, but the question is, how can we begin to cultivate communities of care? Now that might seem like a fairly glib or misty-eyed way of talking about it, but I think a community like this is a really great example of where we can start to think about kind of infrastructures, social and affective emotional infrastructures in which we can begin to share these sorts of experiences, talk about them, and then think about new ways in which this information can be shared. And so the idea of kind of social media, the sort of social platforms that might be available to help share this information, I think is critically important. The model, the Are You OK model, is I think a really nice one, because it's modelled on, in addition to a social media platform, interpersonal, individual contacts. The idea of us taking on ethical responsibilities for one another. The idea of intervening where there is a concern about a colleague or a concern about a friend, to start a conversation, are you OK? Now, I think that's a really great example for us, because this started as a suicide prevention strategy. Movember's another one, where, these are in a sense, trying to cultivate communities of care, where there is a sense that we have a moral and ethical obligation to one another to look after one another. And so the question is, can we look to other sectors, other fields where these sorts of things can be successful, and draw some of this into our own practice. But I guess I think to go back to one of the things Maureen said, that you know, we have a kind of ethical obligation to look after ourselves, but we also have an ethical obligation to look after one another. And I think, without, again, being too misty-eyed about this, there are other kinds of models that we can draw from, that we can begin to think about how can we bring this kind of conversation into focus, because there's no question that in all of the research, the issue of disclosure is the most critically important thing. Are you okay? The earlier you begin to disclose experiences of symptoms, even if you don't really recognise what those things are, the sooner you can start disclosing those symptoms, the sooner you are going to find a pathway into the kind of care and support that you need, the sooner you're likely to get better. And what I know from startup cultures is that I mean, there's a bit of a kind of hero mentality in a lot of startup culture, this kind of idea that you know, as individuals we have to work hard, we have to be kind of invulnerable and resilient. And I think, you know, so taking that courage to kind of begin to reveal to friends and colleagues that you know, this is hard work and maybe we need a bit of support from time to time. How we can cultivate that as a group together, I think, is an interesting place to perhaps leave it for now to start a conversation. Thank you.
Oh my God, 7:30, we are bang on time.
Oh yeah.
Good job. Please put your hands together to thank all three speakers this evening. Now we set up the chairs for the Q&A session. Can I request all of you to stand up and have a bit of a stretch, because you've been sitting, you've been very efficient. Harry, Cameron, Simon, come on.